All right, we are live. Hello, Alessandra.
Hi.
Okay, so you and I have been in a little bit of a dialogue
Yes.
in the past, I don't know, couple weeks, just about the situation in Italy regarding coronavirus because it's been endlessly frustrating to me to try to communicate to American conservatives the nature of the threat when, especially during a period when it hadn't taken such hold in the United States yet, that maybe more could have been done by way of preventative action and such. But before we get into that, like, what's your situation right now? Like, where exactly are you in Italy, and how are things transpiring?
I'm in Rome right now. I was stranded here in a way. I'm originally from Milan. I was here for work, but I had to stay here because I don't drive. I had to take public transportation to go back home, and it was just too risky. So I decided to stay here instead and follow the guidelines on what they advised us to do, which was to stay at home and as isolated as possible.
Okay, people are complaining about my microphone, so maybe it is bad on my end. How is the audio? Can people just comment if the audio is any better now?
I'm not seeing the comments at all. It may be your microphone, I'm not sure.
Yeah, for the love of God, please don't read the comments. Okay, so how is this now?
It works.
It's better?
Yeah.
Okay. People are saying static. Okay, so I'm just gonna unplug my microphone, my external microphone. And I'm just gonna go with the computer microphone. Can you hear me with this?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's better now, they say. So that's just the computer. All right, so sorry about that. So basically, I was just saying that you and I had been in discussion over the past 2 or 3 weeks or something, maybe a little less, about how I can best communicate with American conservatives the nature of the coronavirus threat, because for the longest time they simply weren't believing that it was real. And that was during a crucial period when preventive action maybe could have been taken. That was not. I think more and more people now pretty much are recognizing that it's a genuine threat. But for our microphone issues, I was just asking you to describe what your situation is. And I know your video feed isn't the greatest right now, but you know what? This is an audio-based format, so you guys have to deal with it. All right.
Yeah, so do I need to repeat what my situation is like here?
Briefly, I guess. Just
Okay, yeah. So I am originally from Milan, which is the capital of the region of Lombardy, which was hit the hardest from the coronavirus. And I have family and friends there, but I was in Rome for work at the time, so I decided to stay here instead and follow the guidelines, which advised us to stay as isolated as possible and not to move from wherever we were. And I had to take, if I had to go home, I would have had to take public transportation. And that was like strongly discouraged because it's one of the fastest way to spread the virus. So yes, I'm here right now and things are a bit better here, but we still have 1,500 cases in Rome. So, I mean, the situation is a bit better in the sense that it's not, the exponential curve is not increasing anymore, but it's still bad. Like, it's not like it's still not really stable and we can't see the results yet. They said that it would take 2 weeks of quarantine to see whether it would work, and we're still not really seeing the results.
yeah, like there was a slight dip in the number of deaths. I think it was 2 or 3 days ago. and then it went a little back up again. So it's kind of hovering in like the high 690 something range.
Yes.
And that might just be like statistical noise, right? That might not be a meaningfully significant shift in the curve yet.
No, exactly. So yesterday we had an increase again, 743 deaths, and today slightly decreased to 683. But it's pretty much the same as it was 2 or 3 days ago. So it's, as I said, we don't really know whether the quarantine is working, and we're not really sure what to do. So yes, this is a situation here now. And I actually read an article yesterday. I might, if I find it again, I'll link it on my Twitter profile on the Wall Street Journal. It was about how East Asian countries like Japan and China or Singapore or South Korea dealt with the disease. And it's so different from our approach. And, you know, people in America think that going into full lockdown is too extreme, but actually, if you look at what these countries are doing, they're taking much stronger measures than we are. Even a country like Italy, which is in total lockdown, we're not even allowed to go outside to take a jog or like walk our dog. It's almost forbidden, or you can do it for like 10 minutes.
So you can't go outside for any reason, or you're discouraged from doing so.
You can go to buy groceries, but now they're checking at the grocery stores because people are finding excuses to go. Sounds crazy, but it's true. To go maybe every day or multiple times a day so that they can go outside.
Yeah, I was reading about how like the big scam is that dogs are being passed around so people can pretend that they need to go be walking a dog constantly in order to get out. Or I think I saw that was happening in France. I don't know if it's happening in Italy.
No, it's happening here as well. Yeah, people are finding excuses to go out, and they're like jogging with their dogs so that they're allowed to jog, and these poor dogs are being dragged behind, or, you know, they find every possible excuse to go out. So they're checking things, checking people at the grocery stores as well, at the pharmacies, and like only 3 people are allowed to enter at the time, depending on how large the store is. So yes, I mean, it's like the restrictions seem very tight, but they're not really. If you look at other countries that are dealing with the issue and who have managed to successfully, as people are saying, flatten the curve, which means stabilizing the number of deaths and new infections.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I'm thankful that the United States is a constitutional republic in most circumstances. But if we're talking about the mechanisms that are required to actually stymie the spread of a pandemic, it may not be the ideal form of government, because I'm looking out my window right now. I live across the street from a park, and they're just kind of people casually walking around, you know, kids playing and stuff. And it's just like, I don't even know what to do exactly. And I live in the New York City metropolitan area. I live in Jersey City, which is right across the river from Manhattan. And it looks like New York City is going to be ground zero in the United States, right? So where I essentially live is like the 6th borough of New York City. So I'm at risk here, and I'm observing self-imposed quarantine and looking out the window. It's just, you know, happy-go-lucky people frolicking around the park. And it's just like, what do you even do? It's hard to know.
Yes, people are having a hard time dealing with this quarantine. And they're just not really taking it seriously. I guess that's a problem with communication as well from politicians. We had in Italy, at the start of the epidemic, it still wasn't a pandemic at the time, we had politicians saying, you know, alarmism is the biggest issue right now. Like, if I can advise anything to people, is to not become alarmists. And this
don't panic is what we hear constantly. It's like, okay, what does that even mean? Like, you're telling me not to panic. What would panicking look like in practice? Me like setting my hair on fire and running around in a circle? Like, I'm not doing that. It's just like a useless injunction.
I mean, I think panic, like irrational panic, which I see in the sense of people like lining up at the grocery store to get everything they can or like take things away from everyone else. And that's not how you stop a pandemic. Like other people need to take care of themselves too. Like it's not just about you. So that's like irrational panic. And also people like crowding at airports or train stations or grocery stores, and they don't understand that that's one of the easiest way to spread the virus. But like rational panic is understanding that it is actually a very severe issue, and rationally like finding a way to take care of yourself and make sure that you are not a risk towards other people, because it's not just about you. It's about others as well, especially those who are sick or the elderly. These are the people most at risk, even though they're like even young people can be affected and even healthy people can be affected. And we've seen this multiple times, but we still don't have enough data to understand how badly it affects those people. But we know that it does. Like you're not immune from it. There's no proven immunity. And even in places like China, you have people who get reinfected. So that's why in China, they're still a bit wary of lifting the lockdown completely, because if people get reinfected, then they're back, to the start. So it's a complicated issue. In America, Trump said that people you're not going to stop. This economy is not going to stop, right? Because that would be, the cure would be even more damaging than.
He warned that we can't let the cure be even worse than the disease or something to that effect, which is to say that if we have a depression that's worse than the Great Depression, which some people are actually forecasting at this point, that could, it's not wrong to say this, that could create a vast amount of death and suffering in its own right. However, why are we musing about that possibility now when everybody pretty much agrees, who is rational, that stringent action must be taken at the present moment to curtail the spread of the disease to the largest degree possible? So we don't need Donald Trump going behind a podium saying, oh, we need the economy back. It's like, yeah, everybody agrees that we need the economy back. This is not something that everybody just decided was suddenly a good idea. It's an extreme circumstance. So, I got in trouble for saying that there's nothing wrong in principle with having a moral utilitarian discussion, at least, about the costs and benefits of cratering the economy into a full-scale global recession worse than anything in 100 years, and using that as something that informs our calculus, at least in terms of how we deal with public policy. But it's sort of different if the president is going on TV, just kind of blithely, musing about that, because it has the effect of, I think, downplaying the severity of the risk, which is something he's already done now for 6+ weeks.
Yes, it is true what he said, that an economic recession would have serious consequences to people's lives. And as he mentioned, people might commit suicide, or, they might fall into depression. And this is certainly a serious consideration. But the thing is, it's not really a trade-off, because if you let this virus spread and there's no proven immunity, just to give you an example, in Italy, we have 51% of overall cases that require hospitalization. And it's true that we only test people who are symptomatic. So that's probably lower than 51% overall, but it's still a large percentage. I would assume at least 20 to 25% of people require hospitalization. And that's not that the hospitals are not built for that kind of capacity. And if the hospitals are flooded, this affects even healthy people as well. It's not just about the elderly. I heard someone say, I don't know, I think it was on Tucker Carlson. He said, oh, I'm ready to sacrifice myself for my grandchildren. But the thing is,
that was the lieutenant governor of Texas, by the way. That wasn't just some guy.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that even if that were the case, you still have hospitals that are like saturated. And so people who need the hospitals for other reasons, were not built for the coronavirus. People go to hospital for other reasons. If they have accidents, if they get sick, and they won't be able to be taken care of. So it's a problem that goes beyond just this virus or it hitting the older generation or people who have pre-existing conditions. And it's interesting because in Italy we have such a high death rate. It's about 9% death overall, because we also test people who died with the coronavirus and not just from the coronavirus. So you have issues of comorbidity. And that certainly makes the death toll appear higher than it is. But there's a moral question there to be made. Is it wrong to test people as dying from coronavirus who died with the coronavirus? These are people who, even if they have pre-existing conditions, would not have otherwise died, or perhaps not have, we don't know. So is it wrong to count them in as deaths from coronavirus? Should we be downplaying the issue?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. My preliminary answer to that would be no, it's not wrong to count them in the tally, because if it's true that they would not have died but for the coronavirus infection, then that was the precipitating cause of their death, right? Even if it does interface with comorbidities. So that seems like a valid thing to me. Like if somebody has cancer, right, and it diminishes their immune system to the point that basically getting a common cold or having some other mild illness kills them, then was cancer like the direct proximate cause of the death? Not necessarily, but you can, in a way, blame the death on cancer, right?
Yes, I think you have to separate deaths that people who would have died anyways, maybe in a short span of time, and like the coronavirus just accelerated their death, or from people who would have survived having a pre-existing condition. And these are like the questions that we have to ask ourselves when we're analyzing this data, because countries like Germany, for example, they have such a very low death toll, and America as well. And it may be because they only assess deaths that are exclusively from the coronavirus as like actual deaths from the virus. And I don't think that's completely fair.
Well, I wouldn't speak too soon about America having a low death toll, because I mean we're at the point where it is rapidly accelerating, especially in New York City, and you have places like New Orleans, parts of Georgia, parts of Florida that seem like they're on the same trajectory. I mean, it could just be that within the U.S., just like across countries, the U.S. is so big that you're going to have regions that are behind other regions in terms of the scale of the spread. So I think New Orleans in particular is going to be very bad. So wouldn't speak too soon in terms of lauding the U.S. for a low death toll. I mean, remember there are partiers on spring break in South Florida, dancing on the beach in their bikinis like a couple days ago.
Completely insane.
Yeah, and like you have police on patrol boats in Miami, putting out photos of college kids. Of course, it's all these rich college kids who for whom the worst thing in the world would be to postpone their spring break plans. They're on the boats.
Interviews that were those are really shocking.
Yeah, right.
Saying I'm not gonna renounce my spring break. I mean, we don't have spring break really here, so that's not as much as an issue. But that's a very dangerous way to spread the disease. And going back to what you said about the death toll increasing in the United States, it does increase in every country proportionately, because as hospitals are overwhelmed beyond their capacity, what we had in Italy is that doctors have to practice triage, which is what you practice during times of war or emergency where you have to choose between which patients should be let live or die. And you do this on it's an ethical consideration based on the likelihood of that patient has to survive. So if it's an older patient, maybe you wouldn't treat them compared to a younger patient who has a life ahead of him or has more chances of surviving. And as you start practicing triage, then obviously the death toll becomes higher because more people are going to die as a result. I don't know in the United States how, what the policy is exactly. Like you said, the fact that you have these constitutional liberties means that the quarantine could not be enforced like it is here or other European countries, right?
Well, there is no single policy. I mean, the U.S. is a federal system, right? So especially in terms of, it's unclear that the president could even issue a nationwide lockdown order that would supersede governors. I mean, there's probably some statute somewhere that a constitutional scholar could dig up that might enable that power, but it's not immediately obvious what that statute would be or whether it would be legal, right? You definitely have challenges that will go all the way up to the Supreme Court. You're probably going to have challenges on even certain local measures that have been implemented. Like, for example, in New Jersey, where I live, the governor held a press conference with the head of the state police a few days ago, and they essentially started declaring, I mean, their standard is so vague. I mean, I get it. I get the logic in terms of how they're justifying their enforcement actions. But what the governor said, Phil Murphy, is that if we catch you outside monkeying around, the police are going to take action. So the legal standard that they're setting forth is monkeying around, which means that obviously the police have a huge amount of discretion in terms of who they're going to issue a fine to or potentially even criminalize. They're actually threatening now to issue disorderly persons offenses, which is actually it's a low-level criminal charge, but it's still a criminal charge. And so stuff like that could, I think, theoretically be challenged within the constraints of the U.S. constitutional system. But one of the problems now is we don't have a uniform policy nationwide. Like, people in Montana and Idaho are going to flip out if they're forced to abide by the same restrictions on their movements that people in San Francisco and New York are being forced to abide by. Right? But that means that nothing's uniform. So we could have a situation where in a month we have an outbreak in Wyoming or something. Actually, there is a case that I read about in the Wall Street Journal where a small town in Wyoming in the middle of nowhere has the same infection rate as New York City, even though it's vastly fewer people. It's the same proportionality. So we don't have a good grasp on how this is affecting rural places in the US. We don't know anything. The best solution, I think, now would be to just have a uniform lockdown policy. That's what Modi just did in India.
Yeah.
But it's almost impossible. Now, even within states, mayors are handling it differently. So it's just kind of intrinsic to the U.S. system that we have no ability to have a monolithic policy anywhere near even Italy. I mean, and forget China and South Korea. I mean, that's a different world.
Yeah. I mean, I saw some articles. There was one in the New York Times which said that South Korea was a good example of how liberal democracy was able to deal with the coronavirus. But our standards of liberal democracy are very different from those of countries like South Korea. For example, they have a very aggressive surveillance program in South Korea where everyone has an app on their phone, and even if you're not infected, and you get a call if you get close to someone who is infected. So that's how widespread the surveillance system is. And they also instituted programs where they separated people who are asymptomatic, all the infected people would be separated into categories of asymptomatic people presenting mild symptoms, severe symptoms, and chronic symptoms. and they would be put into makeshift hospitals or big arenas. You know, they would use stadiums or anything they had at their disposal to separate these people. And they would even separate families and take them out of their homes. And like, this is unthinkable for even European countries, you know, and I think even more so for the United States. So it will be interesting to see how this will affect Western countries. I think it's going to be much worse here. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but
that's not pessimistic. That's realistic. By the way,
yeah.
do you know if they? I mean, does every individual in South Korea have a smartphone? I mean, did the state provide smartphones to like elderly people? Is it? How does that work? Do you know? I'm not sure. I've read about that program, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, do not know. I'm not. I don't have. I read that this is their program. I'm not in contact with people in South Korea, but I am in Hong Kong. I worked there last summer. I was covering the Hong Kong protests, and I also studied for a few months at the University of Hong Kong. So I know people there, and they told me that they were able to avoid the lockdown because they addressed the problem immediately. So people in Western countries who say, oh, look at these East Asian countries, like they are not in a full lockdown. Well, that's because they didn't ignore the issue when it first started. And people started working from home, cutting off all non-essential travel or movement. They were all wearing face masks. This is another big issue. We have authorities, even health authorities in the West, like in Western countries, like in Europe or the United States, telling us that face masks are not useful. Like they don't protect you. That's just a lie. And they say that because there are not enough masks for medical personnel. And that's understandable that you would want to protect people who are more at risk and who can save more lives. But the problem is that you're lying to the public.
My sister is a nurse, and the role that they have her performing now isn't to interact directly with coronavirus patients, but she's still been in the same hospital facility, which you think would compel the suppliers to provide her with a mask, right? But she couldn't get a mask. So she's working from home now, but you know, how incredible is that a nurse and people who actually are on the front lines now, and there were articles about how nurses in Boston had to use racquetball goggles because they couldn't get the proper medical goggles, and they're directly personally dealing with the infected patients who are, as we know, are highly contagious. So I almost don't want to hear from anybody who's like espousing Western supremacism anymore, because clearly there's almost a fundamental defect here if we have to resort to these absurd means to deal with a pandemic that was, I mean, it's not like this materialized out of thin air. And we could have been preparing in mid-January when we were not.
Yes, there is truth to the statement that China lied and it is responsible for creating this pandemic by censoring its journalists or the people or the whistleblowers or even journalists who tried to warn the public in China, but also the world. But it's also true that there was news coming out of China. We did see those scenes of families being separated, of people being dragged into hospitals, of workers on the street disinfecting the streets. I mean, would a country like China, it's a country that has the second highest GDP in the world after the United States, really resort to those measures if it wasn't a serious issue, if it was just the flu? And I see many American conservatives now saying, oh, we're not like Italy, and they find ways to downplay the issue.
They'll say, oh, how's your socialized healthcare going?
Yeah, it's because of socialized healthcare, right? This is the real problem here. I mean, that's just crazy. But okay, let's not look at Italy. Let's look at other countries that are dealing with the issue. How have they dealt with it? Like you said, India went into a full lockdown. So is it?
Well, India went to a full nationwide lockdown. 1.3 billion people. Extremely complex democracy that Americans, including myself, can't even begin to comprehend. I've never been there. I mean, people always kind of like, because of like parochial American issues, occasionally you get like badgered into being forced to have an opinion on India, and I refuse to do so, especially as it relates to Tulsi Gabbard. I don't know if you've been following that, but like there's this like minor controversy that's recurrent over her alleged relationship with the ruling party in India. It's just a whole mess. And I just say, look, I have enough on my plate to understand the political dynamics in South Carolina, okay, which the entire American punditocracy cannot even begin to analyze properly. So I'm not going to make it seem as though I have any standing to opine on India. I mean, have a little bit of humility, okay? But anyway, yeah, like, but India, at least ostensibly, locked down the entire country with only something like 600 reported cases and 0 reported deaths that we know of yet. Or maybe it's not 0, but it's relatively few. And we're still in a position now where they're debating in Florida whether to close down certain beaches on the weekends. Not even throughout the week, on the weekends. That's the big debate in certain places in Florida.
Yeah, that's just crazy. I guess it just shows in a way, the theory of the decline of the West. You know, if compared to all other countries in the world, like Europe and the US, like dealt with this possibly the worst way, and the repercussions long term are going to be devastating. And the more you wait, the more severe the problem is going to be. So that's why, like, back to the original argument on the trade-off between containing the virus and the economy and sustaining the economy. You cannot have a functioning economy if you have most people who are sick, or even half of people, or like slightly below half of the population who is sick, requires hospitalization, or who shows symptoms that require them to stay at home. I mean, how does an economy work that way? Are employers going to provide sick leave? How are they going to pay for their business? You know, it just makes no sense. And also, how are you going to deal with an elderly population or the population with pre-existing conditions? Are you just going to let them die? I mean, do you just let them stay at home and wait? Like, it just makes no sense. Like, when the hospitals are going to be flooded, how are you going to sustain that healthcare system economically as well? Because it has to be paid for.
Yeah, and I mean, the other issue in the U.S. is like it's by design a pluralistic democracy, meaning we make accommodations for different groups, whether they be religious groups, racial groups, cultural groups of various kinds, and make allowances in the law so that everybody can essentially operate with their liberties intact within reason. Right? So you have situations now where one such group, meaning Orthodox Jews, Hasidim, which are highly concentrated in New York City and New Jersey, they've been still having these big weddings, where they're saying it would be a sin to cancel the wedding. And the religious authorities, I guess, have advised them not to have it, but they don't listen. And the police don't want to break it up because it would seem to be infringing on their, religious liberties. And so, I mean, like, you can go find the pictures of them and videos of them having these, like, very fun-looking but dangerous wedding gatherings of 200 plus people in like Brooklyn and Lakewood, New Jersey, and such. And I'm not an expert on China, and I know it's also pluralistic in a way, but my sense is that it's more homogenized, at least in terms of their fidelity to like a national ethic, than the U.S. would be.
Yes, I mean, they also have like an extremely authoritarian government.
Oh, and by the way, you wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal, which I'll link to, about the extent to which China deserves blame for basically covering up the crisis initially or whatever, and how they're trying to use sort of diplomatic overtures with Italy to make amends for it, etc. So it was pretty interesting. So people can read that if they want. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, and China blames the U.S. military for the virus, but I mean, like the relationship between China and the United States has been tense in recent years. But the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, went so far as to blame Italy as well. The Global Times, the Chinese state-run newspaper, published an article after China provided assistance and aid, so-called aid. It wasn't really aid. They actually sold most of their equipment. But anyways, like supposedly providing a country with assistance, an allied country, because Italy is China's main partner in Europe. And afterwards, they published an article saying that actually the virus first appeared in Italy, and they distorted the words of an Italian expert to say that, you know, the virus was here before, it was in China, and actually Italy was the first country where the virus appeared. So it's just crazy, the disinformation they're spreading. But going back to what you were saying about weddings, I just want to maybe make people who are watching understand in America what the situation is like here. The weddings are not allowed, and not even funerals. And I don't know if people saw the scenes from Bergamo, which is a city in Lombardy, and it's the worst affected city in Europe, possibly the world right now. And they have, the army was called in to bring the coffins and the bodies in other areas because there wasn't enough space in the cemeteries or the crematoriums. So that's how severe the situation is. And family members are not even allowed to visit their loved ones in hospital or to attend funerals or to pay tribute to you know, anyone close to them who has died in any way. They hear church bells almost all day, and the church bell signifies that someone has died. And then if they have a family member who was hospitalized or who they know was in a chronic condition, they call in the hospital to tell them if it was their, you know, family member or loved one who died. So that's how severe the situation is. So when I hear these, when I hear about these things happening in the United States of people going to weddings, like huge weddings with 200 people, it's just crazy to me because of how quickly the situation degenerated here. I mean, in a matter of 2 weeks, like it was very severe. We had hundreds of deaths per day, and the country went into lockdown. And apparently the United States is only 2 weeks behind us. So I hope that it will act as soon as possible in order to solve the situation, you know, in a quicker way so that things can go back to normal. Because also the repercussions on the world economy, if the US economy collapses, like people don't realize that it's going to have huge repercussions on the world as well.
Well, I mean, I think people do realize that because that's what happened in 2008 and it caused a global recession.
Yeah. And it's even the economists say that this crisis, this recession will be even worse than 2008.
Yeah, I mean, we had the president of the St. Louis Bank of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is like the central bank of the U.S.
Yeah, I know.
What's that? You know that? Okay, I don't know. Maybe some of the idiots in the comment section probably don't know. But I think I'm saying the St. Louis branch, I think is like, I don't even know exactly. I should have researched this, but I think they have a special role in making economic forecasts. And he said that we could reach 30% unemployment by the second or third quarter, which would be worse than the Great Depression by actually a significant percentage. So yeah, I mean, that's like, if that doesn't jar you into action, I don't know what would. But something I'm curious about is, so like in the early phases of this in Italy, how is it sort of discussed in terms of the political dynamics domestically? Because we had a situation where Donald Trump was not just downplaying it, but spreading outright misinformation. Like I gave you that Spectator article I wrote where he was at a rally in South Carolina that he went to basically just to troll the Democrats because it was the night before the primary there. Like, there was no reason for him to have that rally other than to troll. And he's been doing that throughout the entire Democratic primaries, where he just basically goes to New Hampshire and Iowa and whatever just to mess up traffic and give everybody a headache. So he had a rally, and you saw it. He was saying, he wasn't literally saying that the virus itself was a hoax, but he was saying that the criticism and the attention around the lack of readiness of the U.S. federal government was a hoax. He was saying it was hysteria, and he was doing a just the flu bro thing. And that was mimicked by his supporters for weeks on end, including in the conservative media, where you have dimwits like Trish Regan doing a monologue on the Fox Business Channel in prime time, where she's even saying that the use of the word pandemic was a hoax intended to take down Trump. It was just a continuation of the Democrats trying to take him down with the Russia scandal, impeachment, etc. And I agree that all that stuff was extremely overblown and ridiculous and largely fake, meaning the Russia scandal, the impeachment scandal. I've been one of the few people who's been consistent on this. But then they extrapolate from that this was just part of that same theme, which was wrong. So the people who are really resistant to accepting the gravity of the threat really were conservatives taking their cues from Trump, and you have maybe some scattered left-wing skepticism as well. But I'm wondering what was the dynamic in Italy there, at least in the early stages?
It was definitely not as polarized as it is in the United States, and politicians from across the spectrum put their differences aside to find a common policy that would work to contain this epidemic, because we started having, like I said, hundreds of deaths per day. So suddenly, like, all other issues became irrelevant, obviously. I spoke to some representatives who will not even comment on how the government is managing the situation, because they don't want to create polarization. They don't want to create division at this time. Like, we need unity. There has been obviously criticism, though, with how the government dealt with the situation, especially in terms of the plans to help people and businesses who are now out of work. I mean, Italy was already dealing with a pretty bad economic situation, and now it's much worse. So even people who say things like, oh, the United States is not like Italy, its economy is much better. Well, isn't that a reason why the United States has the opportunity to act on this sooner as opposed to not to? I mean, if a country like Italy, which was already basically in a recession and was suffering from huge unemployment and very low economic growth, decided to go into a lockdown, doesn't that show how severe the situation is, if anything? But like you said, there's some conservative pundits who just verbatim follow anything Trump says. And if Trump were to say tomorrow, like, oh, this is a serious pandemic, we need to all go into lockdown, and he was to enforce martial law, they would suddenly be like, oh yeah, this is a great thing to do. And I mean, I don't take those people seriously, because they just don't know how to make up their minds by themselves. But it is very polarized. I saw in the United States, we didn't have as much of that in Italy, and I am thankful, because I mean, like you said, it just creates really stupid reactions to what is happening, which is a health crisis. I mean, people are in Italy, we have now 7,500 people dead in 1 month. So, and it's a population of 60 million. And I made a calculation yesterday. The US population is about 327 million. That would mean that 38,000 people, Americans, would die every month.
Yeah, and just for comparison's sake, do you know how many people died on 9/11? I'm asking that as a rhetorical question, but it was just below 3,000. Yeah. And think of the effects that had on every aspect of American life for years on end that are still with us today. Obviously, a terrorist attack is a little different than a pandemic, just in terms of how it's processed. and the immediacy and shockingness of it. But still, it is something to be cognizant of. Yeah, in the U.S., everything, especially because with Trump and Trump's opponents, everything gets turned into a Trump-related culture war. I mean, there's no way to avoid it. It's always the pro-Trump versus anti-Trump battling it out, and they can't reason independently of their attachment to this constant Trump culture war, which is why I'm denounced as a fascist when I criticize aspects of the opposition to Trump that I don't view as rational, such as the whole Russiagate saga and impeachment and etc. AOC running around screaming that Trump is presiding over a network of concentration camps. Yeah. That makes me a Nazi or a fascist. And likewise, the pro-Trump people are, they're abandoning Trump, or they're betraying Trump if they say, hey, Donald, maybe you ought to take this pandemic thing a little more seriously. I mean, the only one who did that and bucked the trend was Tucker Carlson, and he had to physically drive to Mar-a-Lago in order to do it.
Yes, Tucker Carlson is one of the few voices of reason who, he will, as from what I've seen, he will make up his mind pretty much independently of what Trump is doing. He openly criticizes some policies by Trump, but that's not the case for many conservative pundits, and that's very dangerous because you're going to have like I said, just a huge health crisis, and the repercussions are still unknown. I was researching the Spanish flu, which happened about 100 years ago, and there was a second wave. The first wave, the similarities were striking with this virus we have now. The first wave just attacked the elderly and people who already had pre-existing conditions. And then the second wave actually attacked young people as well. It was much more devastating. And I want to stress that there is no proven immunity. The United Kingdom under Boris Johnson was supposed to have a herd immunity policy. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yeah.
Okay, this policy meant that the young people, so children and people who are not at risk, would spread the virus so that they would develop immunity, whereas the people who were more at risk, such as the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions, would be locked in their homes. So that way they wouldn't catch the virus. And that's how they would fight it long term. And guess what the United Kingdom did? It went into lockdown.
Because there was a huge backlash to that when people even began to understand the implications of what was being proposed. And then yesterday, the day before, Boris Johnson did a national address where he's saying, you must stay home, and everything was shut down.
And just 2 weeks ago, he was considering this herd immunity strategy. And what did it do? What did it result in? The United Kingdom acting later than it could have, and having now a huge health crisis on its hands. I mean, if you look at the...
I think, and didn't the Netherlands or Belgium, or maybe it was Denmark, propose something similar to that?
It was Sweden.
Was it Sweden? I thought I saw, I don't remember who exactly it was, but yeah, maybe it was Sweden.
It was Sweden. I guess it's the Nordic policy. I don't know, but
yeah,
it is. I mean, they're realizing that it's just too much of a risk, and it doesn't work because there is no proven immunity to the virus. So even if you let it spread among people who are not at risk, you don't know how it will affect them. There are some people who require hospitalization, who are in intensive care, who are supposedly healthy and young, so not at risk. And also, you don't know if people are going to be reinfected a second time.
Yeah, it was the Netherlands. The prime minister in a national TV address said that they were aiming for a controlled spread of a large part of the population to become infected that will allow for increased immunity. I don't know if they followed through on that. This was March 16th, but they at least were, that was at least being proposed.
Yes, you know what? I haven't, to be honest, followed the policy of every single European country.
Neither have I. There's enough going on here.
I know that Sweden is doing that or considering that. I know that Denmark like shut down its borders way before other countries did. And the border issue is another issue which is very polarizing, which I guess shows the weaknesses on, in this case, the liberal side of the argument. I mean, it is true that with closed borders, like this could have been prevented, but also how do you enforce that in a globalized world? You know, it's not just people who come from China. It's all kinds of, like, most manufacturing is made in China. And so this,
and it's not, in a U.S. context, it's not as though coronavirus entered the country by Mexicans sneaking over the border and getting into Texas or Arizona or something, right? So, but at the same time, you're right that it does expose a weakness in the liberal or left perspective, because I don't know how closely you've been following the Democratic primary race, but I mean, there is a huge section of the left intelligentsia that had congregated around mostly Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren to some extent, and then scattered others, where, I mean, they were demanding what effectively was an open borders policy, border abolitionism. That was in vogue amongst the elite left intelligentsia. I'm not saying that was necessarily a view adopted by your average Democratic politician, but these things have a downstream effect where they sort of incubate in the intelligentsia and eventually become adopted. And so you have the Democratic Socialists of America, which has had a resurgence since 2016 when Trump was elected. They're basically the ground troops for the Bernie campaign, or were. I mean, the Bernie campaign is defunct at this point. But you know, but they were the canvassers, the phone bankers. They endorsed Bernie very early on, and at their convention, their national convention last summer, they passed a resolution calling literally for open borders, not metaphorically. They literally used that term, and it's just like, okay, this is sort of an interesting test for people who are saying that border abolition is a sound strategy. Like, how would that work now, right? Is Justin Trudeau a fascist because he agreed to shut down the border of the U.S., the border with the U.S.? Like, it's almost been taken as a given amongst, again, a fairly niche but still loud segment of American left-wing pundits that advocating for any border control whatsoever is inherently fascistic or Nazi. So it's like, how do they now contend with this current reality? How would we deal with that in a pandemic situation if their desires were actually implemented? I still haven't gotten a good answer to that.
no, it just makes no sense. And even, I mean, the World Health Organization, I was just shocked at the amount of misinformation they were able to spread. At the beginning, they criticized countries like Italy was actually the first country in Europe to shut its borders, to shut flights to and from China. First country in Europe. And it was the country that was like most gravely affected because there were many workers, Chinese workers, especially in northern Italy, especially in Lombardy. But the World Health Organization criticized countries that closed their borders, saying this policy doesn't work. And actually, you see countries like Russia and a few others that shut down its borders, and it did work. They had fewer cases. So I
love the irony in the fact that Russia seems to have a much better handle on their coronavirus situation than the U.S. when we've just gone through 3+ years of mind-bendingly tedious Russia alarmism and how they're this disgraceful society who are trying to infiltrate the U.S. and they're evil, and every Russian contract, quote unquote, is like a signifier of something nefarious, and lo and behold,
yeah,
they're curtailing coronavirus at least better than we are preliminarily. I don't know. Maybe they're covering up their data in a way, and it'll get worse, and who knows? But at least for now.
But they couldn't cover up their data to this extent. I mean, even China, which is way more authoritarian than Russia, wasn't able to cover up like really what was happening. They were able to a large extent, but information still like was shown. I mean, I remember seeing these scenes in January, beginning of January, of people being, separated from, like I said, from their families, or being dragged into hospital, or people in makeshift hospitals. Like, you would see these scenes already. So if the pandemic was as bad in Russia, like, we would know. Also, Russia doesn't have the same capacity as the United States. Like, their economy is actually smaller than Italy's economy. It's like way overblown, the potential that Russia has to infiltrate the United States.
Well, they can buy a few $1,000s worth of Twitter bots and Facebook memes, and that means they interfered in our election and caused Trump to win, and they've taken everything over, and Putin is pulling the strings. I don't know if you're aware of that, but that's the narrative. But yeah, I mean, it is sort of funny because when the Russia skeptics would try to put into perspective the power of Russia versus other countries, they would invoke Italy, saying it has a lesser GDP, and they never registered to people because they're focused on, like, literally Twitter bots.
Yes, and actually, Russia is not, like, economically, politically, is not as much as is not a threat, I would say, at all. Like, even if it wanted to be, compared to a country like China, and the focus has been, like, there has been this obsession with Russia, but completely ignoring China, which is, like, way more authoritarian and way more powerful, and has way more control in the United States. Like, I read this piece that said, like, 90% of U.S. pharmaceuticals are made in China, something along that lines, like a very large percentage.
And they control our entire, I mean, not our entire, but they control a huge amount of our just supply chain, which is why we're having such problems now producing basic necessities, right? I mean, I was, somebody got in touch with me recently who works in the medical supply field in the US, and they have resorted to basically breaking the law and smuggling masks and gloves and goggles from, I don't even want to say where, but, like, doing that in order to get them to doctors and nurses that this person knows who need them and can't get them in any other way. That's how decrepit our supply chains are, that they cannot accommodate a disruption on this scale in any conceivable respect.
Well, that's the issue with having, like, a globalized economy, is that you don't, like, you're not self-sufficient. And we had the same problem in Italy with face masks. And we had a problem where at the beginning of the crisis, the outbreak, when it was just limited to Wuhan, China, I remember I was so paranoid at the time, like, I knew already what was going to happen. And I would go to pharmacies and ask for face masks. And they told me, like, they're all sold out. Like, this was beginning of January. They were already, or in December even, they were already sold out. And it was because Chinese citizens would buy, like, so many masks and just, like, ship them to China. And so that's also a reason why there's a shortage of face masks.
I'm lucky because random people on the internet send me masks, so I don't have to go purchase them myself.
Yes,
so that's one of the benefits of having a moderately popular Twitter account and YouTube channel.
Yeah, you're lucky, but many people aren't, and there's this shortage of masks, which is crazy. Like, even the people working in grocery stores here don't have enough face masks. Even people who work in pharmacies, who are very much at risk, don't have face masks. Like, there's a real shortage of equipment. And also there's a real issue with, I think, adapting to a new situation or to an emergency, where people don't think, like, they have to wear a face mask, or they think, like, oh, I'm not going to do that, But I mean, if you look at, I said this before, if you look at East Asian countries, like, they were all wearing masks. Like, at the start of the I spoke to people in Hong Kong, just as the epidemic started in Wuhan, they were all wearing face masks. And they were doing so even before, because they had the SARS outbreak, which, like, affected them severely, much more than it affected us. And they learned their lessons from the SARS outbreak. I remember a few years ago when I was studying in Hong Kong, when I was sick once and I had to go to the hospital, and I had to wear a face mask just to enter the hospitals. Like, they wouldn't let you in, because since the SARS virus outbreak, they learned that if you're sick, you have to wear a mask so that you limit the infection rates. Like, you don't know what people who are sick could have. So it's like a cultural thing, and they were already prepared for it. But I think in Western countries, like there's a problem with adapting to this new like lifestyle in a way. And also they managed to, like, many people ask, like, how is Japan dealing with this issue so well? But they went into lockdown, not a complete lockdown, but because they tackled the issue just at the start, and it didn't get so bad that they had to go into complete lockdown, they were able to prevent that. And so to prevent the economic costs as well. The problem is if the situation goes beyond a certain point, like, you have no other choice but to go into full lockdown.
Yeah. Like when Japan shut down their schools, that's when I knew that it was really serious, because I admit I wasn't following it extremely closely. Early on, I was focused on the presidential race, on impeachment, and other things. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not somebody who's really that into the hard sciences. So it's not like my bailiwick normally to really keep abreast of epidemic news. But when Japan decided to shut down their entire national school system,
yeah,
that's when I knew. I was like, all right, wait a second, because just given the culture around education in Japan, they would never do that unless it was truly necessary.
Yes, and by shutting down large gatherings at the beginning of the outbreak, so schools, like public events, they were able to, and they were all wearing face masks, they were able to contain it. And so, like I said, they avoided this like complete shutdown where, like, we are right now in Italy, where we can't even like take, your dog for a walk outside. But if the situation gets, that's why, like, the trade-off, the supposed trade-off between economics and containment of the virus makes no sense, because the sooner you act, the better it is for the economy. Like, the sooner things can go back to normal, and the fewer containment measures you will have to take. So if the US or any European country had acted right away with shutting down schools and large public events, then they wouldn't have maybe needed to like go to such extreme measures by shutting down everything and forcing people into their homes. But the situation is what it is right now, and I just hope that like more stringent measures will be taken in the US, because it's going to be devastating. And there's some people saying,
we're still getting it in piecemeal. I mean, every day you'll have a certain county, like North Carolina. I just saw shut down Mecklenburg County, which is where Charlotte is, which is the biggest city in North Carolina. But it's all piecemeal, right? It's all incremental. There's not, again, a uniform response to anything. So it's still going to be probably another week or two, or maybe even more, until everything that needs to be shut down is truly shut down. And in all honesty, it might never happen, just given the nature of the system.
And I heard like some conservatives make this insane argument in the US, because like I follow many of them, and they were saying like, oh, but there's like a trade-off with, and even some liberals made this argument, to be fair. Like I saw Glenn Greenwald said like sweeping surveillance powers could be an issue, and it definitely could be. Like the government, if it's going to take like such extreme measures, is going to have more power, and it's not maybe going to give that power back very easily to its citizens. But like, what else can you do really at this point? I mean, is it worth? Some people say like, oh, you sacrifice liberty for security, and there's this trade-off. I've always been in favor of not having like mass surveillance programs. Like they weren't effective to combat terrorism. But in the case of a pandemic, there's really, I guess, not mass surveillance programs, but having some kind of checks on people who are infected and how they affect others, because otherwise, like, more and more lives are getting lost. And it's not this situation where you're going to make this sacrifice for liberty, because you're just infecting more people. and those people are going to die. You're not heroic by just like being negligent and not doing anything about it. You're not fighting for liberty. You're just like spreading a disease. So
yeah, I mean there are some. It's funny because like the conservative pundits who will think that they're brave truth tellers by not adhering to restrictions. I mean, they'll also accept civil liberty violations in numerous other respects, like surveilling Muslims and things. Like, I'm not even necessarily arguing one way or another on that question. It's just that, like, it's obviously not a consistent standard for them. It's just they think that there's they still think that this is driven by left-wing hysteria in some way that I guess Trump has even succumbed to at this point. And so there's like they can't really get on board with whatever protective measures are really required. I guess in their sort of conspiratorial paranoid vision of things, Modi decided to shut down the entire country of India because he's a secret left-wing fanatic who wants to harm Trump's re-election campaign. I don't even know what the logic is anymore. It doesn't make any sense. That's just the way certain people think. I mean, and there also is a culture, especially in rural places, that transcends just pure pro-Trump reflexive sentiment, whereas they don't want the government infringing on anything, ever. They don't care. I mean, there could be a nuclear holocaust and they wouldn't accept it. You know, like ranchers, militia people, you know, out in wherever, Idaho or something. I mean, those people do exist. And that's just a segment of the population. It's not a huge segment, but their population, they're just never going to listen ever. So you have to just kind of accept that and not even get too bothered about it, because it's just an undercurrent of American political and cultural life, which is going to be present no matter what.
Yes, I'd just like to say for people to relate to what is happening in Italy right now, that at the beginning, the same exact arguments were being made here. Like, we are not going to shut down the economy. You know, there were hashtags saying Milan won't stop. Milan is the city where I'm from. Like, even my friends were sharing these like idiotic and like just a few days later, you know, there were red zones, and then there was like quarantine in the whole region, and then it extended to like the whole country in lockdown. So, and those people who made those arguments had to admit that they were wrong. But what I want to like convey is that this it's the same mental process that people go through. At the beginning, it's just like denial. You don't really want to admit what's going on. Like, the costs are just too big right now. Like, you don't see like the damages that this might incur until like it actually happens right under your eyes, and you're seeing, you know, hospitals being flooded, hundreds of people dying a day, doctors saying that they have to practice triage, and then you understand how like grave the situation is. But we had those same exact arguments being made here, and they just, you know, had to admit that they were wrong, because there really is no other way to address it. In France, the thing is, like, it's despite the fact that it happened in China, and then it happened in Italy, and then in Spain, and like the same exact reaction took place in every single country. Like, no,
Iran? I mean, the same reaction in Iran happened, actually.
Yes. I don't know like what happened in Iran or what is happening in Iran. Like, it's,
well, I mean, like for example, some of the religious authorities refused to shut down mass prayer gatherings at various Islamic sites.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a similar instinct there, you know, where they're not willing to allow what they regard as their liberty to worship to be overridden by anything. But I think now, because of the situation in Iran is horrendous, that's changed. And you had at one point a couple weeks ago, like 8% of the national governing body, I don't know if it's even the legislature, I guess the parliament, was infected. I don't know what the status is now, but we have already a couple members of Congress who have it. we have a situation now where we're in the process of passing a gigantic stimulus / recovery / relief bill, much bigger than what was passed in 2008 during the financial crisis. Certain estimates by Matt Stoller, who follows this stuff fanatically, he's almost a crazy person, but he's usually right. He's saying that it's between a $6 and $10 trillion bill, trillion with a T, and they're in a position now where they're trying to. So it's got to pass the Senate first, and they're in a position now where they're trying to get it passed in the House by unanimous consent, because all the 435 House members are dispersed throughout the country, and they don't want to have them come back to Washington by plane or whatever mechanism because certain members are infected, right? So it's just insane that they're having this massive bill and they're not even going to have a full roll call vote on it.
Yeah, I mean, Parliament was suspended here. And some people criticize that decision, saying that like certain people are forced to go to work, and so should politicians, like to find a solution. But I don't really have a strong position on that. But yes, you have then you start having issues when you realize that politicians are getting infected. That's when politicians start to care, right? When they see that they're getting infected as well, yeah. Or members of the royal family, and then you start even having, which is even worse, having the police being infected, and so they can't do their job properly. In Italy, we had people rioting in prison.
I think Mitch McConnell started taking it seriously when his margin in the Senate diminished because like 5 senators had to quarantine.
Yeah.
So like the Republicans have barely a majority now in the Senate, which is like the prime motivation of Mitch McConnell's entire life, to maintain a Republican majority in the Senate. And because of coronavirus, it doesn't exist anymore.
Yes, I mean, in Italy, it was mostly the left-wing politicians who were like the champions of like the economy won't stop and we will keep on going. And like there was this huge campaign in January, beginning of January, when the outbreak started in China. Apparently, like Chinese controlled like papers were like trying to spread this message of telling people to hug a Chinese person to fight discrimination. So like we had people literally
let a Chinese person cough on you.
Yeah, there were people on the street. I'm not kidding you. They were taking masks off Chinese people's face. By the way, that's just like plain rude, in my opinion. Like if somebody were to take my mask off, like in the middle of the street,
don't touch me, you idiot.
Yeah, just to like as a show like a defiance against racism or discrimination, because people weren't going to Chinese restaurants anymore. Like Chinese businesses were not doing well, and it's like I understand that's an issue, but like now look what happened, And one of the politicians that was spreading this message, he was this left-wing politician. He was one of the first one to be diagnosed with infected with the coronavirus. And it's funny because he didn't have symptoms, and it's like these people have no shame. Because in Italy, like, and most countries in the U.S. as well, only people who have symptoms, and actually severe symptoms as well. Like I had a cough about a month ago, and I was worried, and I called the hotline, and they said, no, you have to have a cough, a high fever, and shortness of breath. So basically, like, I need to be like in a
you have to be near death.
Yes, thankfully, like I didn't have anything, but only people who show severe symptoms can be tested. But politicians like openly say, I was tested and I'm negative, and I had no symptoms at all. So like they had the privilege to get tested before anyone else. But this happened to a politician in Italy who was very much against this idea of creating panic for the coronavirus, and he was one of the first ones to be tested with the virus, and then he started taking it seriously.
Well, we have at least one member of Congress, Ben McAdams, who's he's like a conservative Democrat from Utah, who I believe, maybe I shouldn't say this without confirming it, but I believe he's been put on a respirator now. He's one of 3 who has it.
Yeah, I mean, there Prince Charles was tested
Or he's at
positive
least
today.
hospitalized. Maybe, I don't know if he's on a respirator or not, but he was his he has a relatively serious case at least.
Yeah, like I said, when politicians start getting affected, like they will take it seriously. And I think you're going to start seeing that in the U.S. and not just politicians, but authorities and healthcare workers as well. In Italy, just
Well, I
even.
mean, I think conservatives started taking it seriously when like a vector of it became the CPAC conference.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I remember that. Like people were panicking. Another big issue is also like I was saying, the healthcare workers who start getting infected, because once they get sick, like who is going to get who is going to take care of the people who need that assistance? And in Italy right now, just to give you another crazy statistic, almost 10% of healthcare workers have the virus, and that's like of all cases, 10% are healthcare workers. That's like a very.
So, of the total number of coronavirus cases in Italy, 10% are healthcare workers.
10%. Yeah, it's like 9%. Yeah. So, but because they're constantly exposed, and many of them don't even have the equipment, like the appropriate equipment that they need. Like you don't like they need the hand suit vest, but some of them don't have it. Like I see like videos of doctors who are in hospital who just have a face mask, like we're not fully covered. I mean, I just don't know if you saw that Sky.
Yeah, I saw it.
Yeah, so there was Sky published this report on Italy where it was like this video report, which is crazy. I would invite anyone to go see it. And the journalist was actually much more prepared than.
He was in a full hazmat suit.
Yeah, he was much more protected than most of the health care workers, and that's because there's a shortage of equipment, and that's another big issue, like having to bring back production home, and this is going to really change the world in my view. The globalized world will no longer exist, at least in this capacity anymore.
No, I mean, the entire relationship with China economically is going to be probably upended. I'm assuming there's probably going to be an industrial policy now that's implemented in the U.S. for the first time in many, many years. And you're going to see interesting sort of cross-partisan cooperation on that issue, I think. I mean, there's going to be conservatives and leftists or whatever who are interested in forging some kind of path on this. I would even imagine, old Uncle Joe Biden would probably support, changing around the industrial policy in the aftermath of this. It's going to become just a mainstream issue, I think. Trump screamed about China when he was running in 2016, but, he didn't really do anything other than start a relatively pointless trade war. I mean, it's not as though the supply chains are any different than they were when he took office. But now you're going to see like a pretty almost universal you're going to see universal attention to fundamentally reevaluating the economic systems between the U.S. and China.
Yes, that's like it's definitely going to change the world, this crisis, and more than we understand right now. Also, another issue which is not really discussed because we're at the beginning of the crisis is the effects, like the psychological effects it will have on people. In Wuhan, I was reading this report from a journalist I know is in Beijing, and they had to create new psychological institutions to assist people who were in a depression or who were suicidal, because it does really have a toll on people's lives, economically, psychologically, and so it requires like huge investments in like the and public investments too. So even the free market ideology is going to be questioned. Like there's no other choice really. both in terms of healthcare, but also in terms of just assisting families or people who are dependent on a job and who are not getting paid anymore. Like they need an income, right? It's like you can't just let them, not work, like force them not to work, but then not compensate them in any way.
Yeah, so that reminds me. What is the setup for state provision to people in Italy right now? I mean, is there like a income replenishment? Because this bill now that's being considered in Congress allows for a one-time cash payment of $1,200 to everyone making less than $75,000. So it's not even a universal basic income payment. It's actually means tested, and you get a grand total of $1,200. And that's what I guess people whose businesses are now bankrupt and cannot work for probably months, they're gonna have to live off $1,200, and you have rent payments coming up in like a week. So what's the situation in Italy on that?
Here, rent payments were suspended. Bill like payments like water bills, electricity bills, all this stuff, and taxes were suspended. But it's not enough. Like people still need to pay for their food and like, provide for themselves. And so they're still considering what to do because Italy is highly dependent on the European Union right now, and it's not receiving any kind of real help from the European Union or the European Central Bank in terms of like financial assistance. But what people need, in my view, is a universal basic income to sustain themselves during this crisis, and that's going to require like huge investments and a recession for sure. What is the other choice? There's that economic argument, but that I guarantee you that that economic argument will not survive long because it just makes no sense. You're gonna see when you start seeing so many people get sick and like requiring hospitalization. Like we had people in hospitals who like are on the floor, not receiving treatment. We have I heard of this family who like didn't even know, because there are so many like the death toll in the city of Bergamo, which I mentioned earlier, which was one of the hardest hit cities in Europe, if not the world. The death toll is so high that like they can't keep count of how many people die sometimes, or they like lose the bodies. They don't know where the bodies went because it's just like delirium. Like they can't handle the situation. They're overwhelmed. And we had Russian assistants come in a few days ago, and there were pictures today circulating on the Russian army helping the city of Bergamo, because it's just, I mean, the situation is so bad.
Yeah, I mean, I agree on universal basic income. It's just that, the Congress, as I've been screaming on Twitter, to no effect, they could have just passed a one-page bill allowing for monthly payments of whatever, $1,200, $1,500, $1,000, $2,000, whatever figure you pick. They could have done a one-page bill until allowing for that until such time as the crisis is declared to have ended. And of course they didn't. They're haggling over everybody's pet project, massive corporate bailouts. I mean, essentially now the U.S. taxpayer is going to be on the hook in perpetuity for bailing out the entire U.S. corporate sector. I mean, that's just an incredible statement, but it's effectively true.
And that mostly what happened during the financial crisis as well.
Yeah, but at least that was sort of limited to the banking sector. I mean, this is every sector. Yeah. So the airline industry, the crew, not maybe every sector is an overstatement, but like they have a $500 billion fund that the Secretary of the Treasury, Mnuchin, has sole discretion to allocate however he pleases. Whatever company or corporation can be described as distressed in some way, meaning whichever corporation has the savviest lobbyists, they could just get bailout money now with effectively no strings attached. I mean, they're going to appoint like an inspector general, and they're going to convene a panel a year afterwards or something, which is just utterly toothless. So
Yeah.
I mean, it really is just a corporate slush fund, and I get there probably does need to be industry aid to certain critical industries.
Yes.
But like the cruise line industry is not a critical industry. I'm sorry. I know people in Florida get mad at me when I say that, but you don't have to take your your Royal Bahama liner or whatever out to the islands. That's not necessary for the sustainment of the nation. But it's just going to all depend on who has the best lobbyists. I mean, that's why Boeing now is getting a bailout. So we devoted a huge amount of legislative energy to giving a bailout to a weapons manufacturer rather than having annual or monthly universal basic income payments to workers who got laid off from their restaurant and service jobs. I mean, it's just insane.
Yes, like you said, there is a balance there between the helping the industry survive. Like you can't have just like entire industries like shut down and fail. But also there is an argument to be made that you can't just bail out the corporate system and not.
I mean, so many of these corporations, sorry to interrupt, but some of these corporations just got a humongous corporate tax cut in 2017. And that's really the only thing Trump got done in terms of a major legislative accomplishment, Paul Ryan's tax cut. And so they were flooded. And so they could have stocked up on cash reserves, but they did stock buybacks, and they have no cash reserves. So that they can't even survive for a month in an emergency scenario. How is that responsible corporate management? And yet we have to bail them out right away.
Yes, I mean, I guess they want those businesses to survive because they're a whole I mean, it is true that once you get out of the crisis and you want the economy to start going again, like you need those industries, right? You need those businesses, but at the same time, like you cannot just bail out those companies and not pay any attention to the individual citizens, because this is a crisis, like a health crisis. It's not even like during the financial crisis. It was like they bailed out. Well, it was even worse in a way because they bailed out the financial industry, which was responsible for the crisis to begin with. But in this case, it's a pandemic, so you have to help individual citizens. Like they all have a right as being like citizens of your country to receive some kind of assistance if they cannot work. Right? It's not their responsibility. It's not their fault. And that's where you need government to intervene. Like you need big government or whatever you want to call it to intervene and help those people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we should wrap up. I know it's getting pretty late there, but I do have to constantly point out the irony that those of us who actually generate an income from online media are like not inconvenienced at all by this. Like I get my revenue over the internet, so I'm just sitting at home all day anyway working. And so like I can't relate at all to these people who like lives are upended. So I have to like draw on my empathic resources to relate to that, because like if anything, it's hugely ironic that there's probably going to be more demand right now for the stuff that I, and I guess you to some extent, produce.
Yes, I also have to be like overly like sensitive and like careful on what I say, because it doesn't affect people like us as much as others. But at the same time, there is a reason why this measure was taken everywhere. So it's not just like us being privileged and saying, everyone else can't work and like I can keep on working. No, it's just like a policy that was taken by most, if not all, countries in the world who are affected, except the United States right now.
Yeah. All right, let's leave it there for now. This was very edifying. So thank you for the stream. Thank you. You didn't read the comments. That would have been a disaster. And maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Sure.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.